can still own a gun, provided you take the following precautions. 1. Establish a legitimate need for owning a gun. 2. Apply for and receive a shooter's license. 3. Register each individual gun in your possession. 4. Store all guns and ammunition in safe, separate locations. 5. Store both under lock and key. If you haven't already taken these reasonable precautions, act now. Time is fast running out. The gun amnesty ends December 17.
Good day everyone, Ethan Nash from TOTTnews.com here on the 13th of December 2018, and today we're going to take a brief look at another important topic we have discussed quite a bit over the years, and that is the truth about Australia's gun laws. Now, Australians pride themselves on telling it like it is, but when it comes to gun laws, straight shooting often takes a back seat to a determined effort at silencing debate. In 1996, Australia passed some of the most restrictive gun laws in the Western world. These included bans on self-loading rifles and self-loading and pump-action shotguns, universal gun registration, and a taxpayer-funded gun confiscation program costing over $500 million. In this video, we're going to take a look at 3 important questions surrounding the gun debate here in Australia, and those are: 1. Was gun violence a problem in Australia before Port Arthur? 2. Did laws introduced following result in a decrease in gun-related crime? And 3. Is Australia a safer place due to the introduction of these laws? Let's explore, shall we? In 1996, Australia passed the National Firearms Agreement after a mass shooting in Tasmania of April that year. We will discuss this event at the end of this video, but according to the official story, 28-year-old man Martin Bryant, armed with a semi-automatic rifle, shot and killed 35 people and injured 18 others in what has become known the world over as the Port Arthur Massacre. Now, under the 1996 law, Australia banned certain semi-automatic, self-loading rifles and shotguns, and imposed stricter licensing and registration requirements. It also instituted a mandatory buyback program for firearms banned by the 1996 law. Now, during the buyback program, Australians sold 640,000 prohibited firearms to the government and voluntarily surrendered about 60,000 non-prohibited firearms. In all, more than 700,000 weapons were surrendered, according to a Library of Congress report on Australian gun policy. In 2002, Australia further tightened gun laws by restricting the calibre, barrel length and capacity for sporting, shooting handguns. The ongoing costs of running the firearms regulation systems are unknown, but they've been estimated at around $28 million per year, or $75,000 per day. Now that's more than the average Australian earns in an entire year. Now, the notion expressed by the establishment at the time was that stricter bans and measures on regulations would prevent another attack like this from happening. But is this really the case? Now, before taking a look at some of the statistics associated with this claim, it's important to note that statistics in themselves are easily fallible. In fact, it's actually a common occurrence whenever you hear some form of statistic on any subject. Most of the time, to satisfy conceit, corporations and governments manipulate statistics to suit themselves and pretend that the science is settled. This is an outright lie. When you look at the facts openly and without bias agenda, it becomes very obvious that the Australian experiment with gun control is nowhere as clear-cut as the gun prohibition lobby wants the world to believe. Australia's gun homicide rate was tiny even before gun laws went into effect. Now, media propaganda and the education system have programmed a new generation of Australians to believe that this country was a terrible, violent place when semi-automatic weapons were legal. But this is simply not the case. In 1993, for example, a total of 64 people died from gun homicide in the entire country. That's a rate of 0.36%, less than one person per 100,000 people. Now, I could list 100 other common things that kill more Australians each year, such as behavioural disorders, which kill close to 8,000 people just in 2012 alone. As a point of reference, the US gun homicide rate in 1993 was more than 8 per 100,000 people, according to statistics. Now, similar statistics are also found in most years, both before and after the Port Arthur massacre, with the event being a statistical anomaly that claimed most of the lives for that year. The second key point to examine here is that homicide rates in Australia were already being addressed before Port Arthur occurred, with many studies identifying trends that oppose the collective viewpoint that gun control equals a drop in crime rates. This is simply not the case. A 2003 study from AIC, which looked at rates between 1991 and 2001, found that some of the decline in firearm-related homicides and suicides began before the reform was enacted, and that homicides via handguns actually increased in the same period. Yet another study from 2008 from the University of Melbourne also concluded that the buyback had no significant effect on firearm suicide or homicide rates. This decline in Australia is not unique or unusual either. At least 2 other Commonwealth countries, Canada and New Zealand, experience similar or greater declines in death over the same time, even though those countries have far less restrictive gun laws than Australia. Already we can see that Australia was not a country associated with violent gun-related homicide before Port Arthur, and we can see Australia was already trending in a direction that was reducing each year. Now, our statistics are tiny in comparison to other similar Western countries like the United States, although semi-automatic weapons are not responsible for most of the homicides there either, according to the FBI. Next thing you know, Port Arthur happens and a national firearms agreement scheme was enacted. But where was the justification to prove this anomaly is actually a widespread problem? If homicide rates were already extremely low until an anomaly event occurred, that being 0.36% of the population, and the statistics already showed either small or decreasing trends, why were the people punished for an event that would likely not happen again, statistically? Why was there no royal commission to investigate the event and enforce serious intelligence and legal safeguards to prevent a future attack? Why did our Prime Minister almost immediately call for this ban? Many of you watching will already know the answers to these questions. But despite all of this, There remains further elements to the overall argument of the anti-gun lobby than the notion that gun laws halted an existing problem here in Australia. And most of it has to do with the lasting effects that the laws have had. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, you would have seen that Australia's gun laws have become a cult symbol to anti-gun enthusiasts all over the world, with even Barack Obama and other world leaders referring to our great success in speeches following other mass shootings. You would have heard all the talk, Australia is a safer place, we haven't had a mass shooting since, the list goes on and on. But how many have actually taken the time to analyse the evidence for themselves, as opposed to either parroting narratives that they have heard, or appealing to authority or consensus? The number of homicides in Australia actually increased in 1997 and peaked in 1999. That is, 2 out of the 3 years that followed the introduction of the gun laws, there was already a spike in already decreasing homicide statistics. Think about that for a minute. Now, the reason this is not discussed is because from 1999 until 2007, it has then declined to the lowest number on record. And this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning about statistics. There was a clear spike in the initial years since the ban was introduced, which are the most crucial years to analyse change in a society. Yet the anti-gun lobby will focus more on the modern era as a reference to this argument. But are the gun laws even responsible for this decline either? Well, even one of the most referenced analysis papers on Australia's gun laws, released by David Hemingway, director of the Harvard Injury Control Research Center, couldn't even substantially conclude the laws actually are the underlying reason for the decline. And this is based on studies that they analysed when arguing whether implementing similar laws in the US would work. The authors noted that, quote, no study has explained why gun deaths were falling or why they might be expected to continue to fall. Yet most studies generally assume that they would have continued to drop without the National Firearms Agreement, end quote. It poses difficulty in trying to definitively determine the impact of the law, they write. So the anti-gun lobby continues to praise things such as a declining homicide rate, yet can't even determine that gun control is responsible for this. Well then, despite this intentional conundrum, others have also suggested that there may be a few reasons for the decline in statistics at the turn of the century. Firstly, the most likely reason statistics began to decline following 1999 was because of advancements in technology that were able to aid authorities to prevent crime and enforce measures accordingly. Technology, some say, is far more likely the result, not the gun reform. Secondly, statistics also continue to decline because Australia's population has grown substantially since 1996, making the homicide rate per 100,000 people much lower by nature and easier to twist to support a statistical agenda. These are just a couple of talking points that can account for a steady decline in homicide rates at the turn of the century. If gun reform was the underlying reason, we would have seen a massive decline in those crucial first 3 years following the laws being introduced, and we didn't. In fact, we saw the opposite. We also saw knife attacks, home invasions, and other violent crimes also spike during this period, because criminals will always find a way to keep their trade alive, while law-abiding citizens face the consequences. This includes assaults and sexual assaults, which have both increased steadily in the past 10 years by over 40% and 20% respectively. Taking a step back here, we have now examined the first two questions initially asked at the beginning of this video. 1. Was gun violence a problem in Australia before Port Arthur? The answer is no, not per capita or in comparison to other Western nations. 2. Did laws introduced following result in a decrease in gun-related crime? The answer is no as well, as trends suggest homicides peaked at the turn of the century only to be brought down with the addition of technological advancements, whilst other related crimes also increased and continued to do so. The underlying concept here is that these 2 points attempt to prove, according to the anti-gun lobby, that Australia is a safer place to live. But is this the case either? As of 2015, Australia's national arsenal of private guns is larger than it was before the Port Arthur massacre. In an article published by the ABC entitled "The Truth About Gun Ownership After Port Arthur," the author explains how, quote, "the proud claim that Australia may have solved the gun problem might only be a temporary illusion," end quote, and, quote, "in recent years, arms dealers have imported more guns than ever before, and last year we crossed a symbolic threshold. For the first time in 20 years, Australia's national arsenal of private guns is larger than it was before the Port Arthur massacre," end quote. I also wanted to quickly point out the next paragraph of the article while we're here, and that reads, quote, "The increase must be seen in context. Australia's population grew by 5 million in the same period, so per capita, firearm ownership remains 23% lower than it was before Port Arthur," end quote. So again, this here is what I'm describing when I talk about the deceiving language the anti-gun lobby uses. The fact of the case is that Australia has imported more guns than ever before in 2015. The million guns destroyed after Port Arthur have been replaced with 1,026,000 new ones, and the surge only continues to show upward momentum. However, because Australia's population has grown on a per capita basis, it still remains almost a quarter lower. You see, population doesn't change the amount of guns that are here. More people surrounding the people with the guns is not a sign that there is less importation of guns. You see what I'm trying to say here? It's this type of media propaganda that would make Edward Bernays so very proud. In fact, the 1996 firearm laws were immediately followed by a mass buying spree, as banned rapid rifles and shotguns were replaced with freshly imported single-shot firearms. Yet there is no mass shootings. Funny that. It's almost as if the shooting was an anomaly that didn't represent the majority of law-abiding citizens. Oh, that's right, we did cover that earlier. I guess to conclude, what I wanted to point out here that most that support gun control as an effective tool to curb crime always include the Port Arthur event in any statistics when doing so, despite, as I said, it being an anomaly that made up almost all of the deaths for that year. Now, when you remove this anomaly from the statistics, a different picture is painted, and there is now a growing body of peer-reviewed research into the impacts of Australia's 1996 gun laws that verify these claims. And yet, despite all of the scientific evidence to the contrary, when you put all of these together, the anti-gun lobby continues to promote untruths unchallenged. Notwithstanding the massive price tag that's attached to Australia's gun laws, proper debate is still not taking place. Despite the fact that other policies may be far more effective at saving lives, dissenting views about the gun laws are ridiculed and shouted down swiftly. Yes, the rest of the world can indeed learn a lesson from Australia's gun experiment. But that lesson is really not about gun laws. It's about the dangers of allowing lobbyists, politicians, and the media to prevent a rational debate. Thank you to everyone for watching, and before I wrap up, for those that are interested, we're finally set to release our work on the Port Arthur massacre in the near future, exposing the lies associated with the very underlying justification of the gun laws themselves. Now, for those who aren't familiar, we spoke with cafe witness and infamous first medical responder Wendy Skerr in an exclusive interview in 2015, and have thousands of never before seen files that are set to open a whole new generation to the lies being used to keep the Australian people disarmed. So to find out more about any of that work that's on the way, to read any of the papers or articles that we've discussed in this video, or if you're just looking for more hard-hitting content here in Australia, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out tottnews.com for more information. And until next time, friends, you look after one another.